talk here just about a little bit of a different perspective, which is the perspective from journalism, and not exactly the kind of journalism or data journalism approach that Kaylin described, but a little bit of a different approach. I'll go through it quite quickly. Just as a very brief introduction, BBC News Labs is this small group of about 20 people, multidisciplinary, includes engineers, journalists, product managers, designers, and so on at the BBC that essentially experiment with the kind of new ways of producing, distributing, and consuming news. So that's where I'm coming from with this. So to start, I'll just sort of acknowledge this reality that news stories which originate in data, which would not exist except for data, are rapidly becoming a fairly significant minority of news stories. And we see this in everyday day-to-day stories. And these are just some headlines from yesterday on the BBC website for stories that are primarily about or coming from data. And these are not stories including COVID. If you include COVID stories, about half the stories on the website seem to be kind of originating in data. But the COVID stories are part of this sort of trend that has been around for a while, of these enormous mega stories that extend over years or even decades that are very, very data intensive. So in addition to more and more everyday stories, there are more and more of these, or more and more attention given to these mega stories that are data driven. And then if you get down into local stories, there are almost an infinity of small stories from small data sets of various kinds, from all kinds of different sources. And these are becoming a bigger and bigger part of people's kind of local news experience. So news originating data is a bigger and bigger deal. But traditional journalism is not very well set up to deal with data stories. And I'm talking here about journalism, not data journalism. We'll get to data journalism in a minute. One reason is that data or journalism, traditional journalism, is handcrafted. It's very author-based, artisanal. It's not systematic or industrial. It's bespoke artifact by bespoke artifact by bespoke artifact. This is how articles are written. This is how television programs are made, and that doesn't line up too well with data. Journalism tends to come from a literary or an arts perspective rather than an analytical perspective. As a result, a lot of journalists don't really have the skills to cover data stories. Journalism is very selective. Journalists talk about this nose for news, where the journalist decides what's a news story, or what particular aspect of a news story is important, and then they tell that story. There's no idea or concept of sort of systematic coverage that's kind of independent from the sort of the selection of an individual journalist. And as a result of that, the news products, the articles, the programs, the channels for distribution, and so on, are typically one size fits all. In other words, there's one article for everybody, or there's one television program for everybody, and that by necessity has to be the national or the general perspective, rather than down into the little minute detail that might be more relevant to news consumers. So journalism's kind of response to this is data journalism, and data journalism basically comes out of traditional journalism. There's a long kind of history of this, originating as far back as the 50s, actually, but really taken off in the 70s and the 80s around computer-aided reporting and so on. And that's kind of where data journalism is coming from this traditional journalism background. And as a result, it has a lot of the characteristics of traditional journalism. So data journalism stories are typically these kind of one-off, big, kind of flagship, infrequent production stories that get awards or attention or do what they need to do, and then they go away, and then some other big flagship story comes along. They're typically based on aggregations of data. You do have exceptions to this, but you're typically talking about the entirety of the country or the data set and the large stories contained within that. They're not really focused on getting all of the little bits of detail and all of those tiny little specific and relevant stories that exist in many of these data sets. They're usually just a snapshot in time. They don't really repeat very often. Again, they're handcrafted, these sort of big flagship productions, and so when they're done, the journalists often don't go back to them and do the same thing again next year or next month. And then they're usually communicated in text or in visualizations that are really easy for kind of educated, data savvy people to understand, simple even for educated data savvy people to understand, but they're actually exceptionally complex for most people. And there's a whole literature on this around graph literacy and numeracy that indicates that as much as half the population really struggle with a lot of graphs and charts and visualizations. And these are often these kind of Edward Tufte style, very impressive visualizations. A lot of those are largely impenetrable to a significant portion of populations. And then even text, and this was alluded to in Kaylin's talk. Once you start putting numbers into text, people really tune out. This is a heat map from a study that we did with the University of Nottingham using eye tracking to measure the dwell time and skip rate of people's eyes on words and phrases. And the red is basically high cognitive load. As soon as you hit a number, basically half the population just kind of tunes out. We compared, our control group was university students, and our target group was working class people, young people. And as soon as a number shows up, boom, you've kind of lost the audience. We've kind of showed that cognitively. So these complex text or complex visualization style of communication is not working too well for half the audience. So, what could we do? Like, what could we do with data journalism to kind of fix this? What could we do to tell essentially all the stories that are in these data sets instead of just a select few stories? What can we do to tell these stories all the time on demand? If there's data available, the stories available, what could we do in that direction? What can we do to make these stories personal and local and relevant to individuals, kind of where they live, as it were? What can we do to tell these stories in different ways that suit different people? Tell them in simple ways for some people and in complex ways for other people, visually or text or interactives or different techniques for different people. And how can we adapt them to different devices and modes and contexts that people use to consume news? So how can we do all this? Well, I'm going to propose that we need a different kind of data journalism. We need I'll call it a data journalism 2.0. And this is a data journalism that is digitally native. So it's not rooted in the practices and assumptions of traditional journalism. It's digitally native. And by being digitally native, it is systematic. It covers all the stories all the time and in a personalized way, and not just personalized in terms of the data, but personalized in terms of the storytelling, how the story is told. And there's only really one way to do that, and that is to use automation. So automation in lots of different guises is the path to telling these stories systematically, routinely, and in a personalized way. But because this is journalism, maintaining that automation under editorial control is particularly important. To retain the authority of journalism requires that editorial control, whether it's a handcrafted article or a handcrafted visualization, or whether it's an automated process. So let's look at some examples of how we've done that in BBC News Lab. So we've done that with articles. So this is the projects around the automated writing of articles from data using a technology called natural language generation. It's a kind of natural language generation that's based on templates, where the journalists author the templates, and then the templates write lots and lots and lots of variations of the story based on the data. And so we've published quite a few of these kinds of stories, health stories, local authority stories, local election stories, stories about high streets, and then we published result stories for the general election last year using this technology. So that was an interesting exercise because it was the first time that the BBC had published a dedicated results story for every single constituency in the country. That had never been done before. And we were able to do that because we used this form of automation. In addition, we were able to publish the 40 stories for the Welsh constituencies in Welsh as well as in English. So we could customize the way the story was told, in this case by language. So this was the same data, but used to tell the story in Welsh versus English. So this is possible now. In fact, it's being used by lots and lots of newsrooms. We were not the first to do this kind of work by any means, and it's not a large part of these newsrooms, but it's a significant and growing part of these newsrooms. So this is not some sort of far off kind of science fiction-y thing that we might do in the future. This is stuff that's happening now. A little further from production is a project that we've worked on for most of this year called graphical storytelling. And graphical storytelling, what this project does is it takes an existing article, so they're reporting from an existing article, and it automatically, with some editorial oversight, turns that article into essentially a set of summarizing bullet points that are then used to create comic panels. So these are for comics that are maybe 8 to 12 panels long that together kind of make up the story. And we've actually published from this technique. We published our first story on one of the BBC's social media channels recently, and we expect to publish a lot more of these stories. These are essentially combinatorial assemblies of graphical components based on an understanding of the text of the article. So these are coming from text, not from data. But there's this kind of growing sort of awareness that there are visual and specifically comic ways to tell data stories. And there's been recently there's been work done on the patterns and the template possibilities for these kinds of stories. I know that Benjamin Bach is going to give a talk later on in this symposium about his work in this. And one of the things that's really intriguing us is that if we can take our semi-automated graphical storytelling approach, which is automatically or semi-automatically creating stories from text, combine that with data comic design patterns, we can semi-automate these data comics. In other words, tell data comics or tell stories through comics from data at scale with editorial oversight. And then there's another large range of projects around this space. For example, in top right there, we've done some very preliminary work with a company called Synthesia that moves this to essentially automated video. And this is a fully automated assembly of stories from data into text, and then assembly or trend the reading of that text with a synthetic voice, and then using these Vizime models that use the phonemes and synthetic voice to create talking head synthetic video. It's not really ready for publishing. It's not kind of prime time yet, but it's pretty close. And this is a brand new technology. So who knows where it might go. We've done a lot of work with conversational interfaces for voice. So this is where you take little bits of news, including news that can be assembled using these natural language generation techniques and make them navigable and accessible through voice devices. In a previous role, I did work with a tool that maps queries, natural language queries in a chatbot to a multidimensional data cube, so that you can query very large and complex data sets using just natural language queries. And that works, it's a limited set of queries because you are querying a data cube, but it works very, very reliably within those constraints. And then recently, we've done a project that uses various kinds of summarization, extractive and abstractive summarization, to create gists or bullet point versions, very short, succinct bullet point versions that are suitable for alerts and various other kinds of efficiency-based news consumption, and also image galleries, which do essentially what the comics do, but with journalistic imagery from Getty Images and Reuters and so on for use in Instagram. So all of these tools are either available and used or are very, very close to being available and used to tell these stories. So to do this, like if we wanted to build a new kind of data journalism, what would we need? Well, I think we need a few things. We need standardized data access. We need to sort of get away from data in PDFs or data that changes in its format every couple of months, or data that is just unclean and awkward to use and awkward to navigate and understand. We need standardized data access, and there's a number of projects that are on the way at the moment, different places that are kind of heading in this direction. The Data Commons .org project that Google is driving is an example of that. The COGS project, the Common Data Project that the GSS is driving as part of that, and so on. And this includes standards, just standards, so that authorities or organizations that publish data can do so in a standardized way. That standardized access is critically important. Once you have sort of standard access to data, you have to be able to turn these into stories at some kind of an abstract level. So finding story elements, identifying story elements, extracting those story elements from the data, not just from the data in its most current form, but from historical data. Finding out ways to do that is important. And then there's a whole range of new editorial techniques we need. We need new ways to write for these tools, writing natural language generation templates, design patterns for graphical versions of stories and so on. We need to be able to edit the data. We need to be able to apply the journalistic and editorial rigor on data that we do on text. And then we need ways to enable editorial oversight of the output of these automated techniques. So I'm going to leave it with what I'm going to call a manifesto for data journalism 2.0. And I'll just read this right from the screen here. So data is now a critically important means by which people can understand their world and thereby exercise power in their lives. Data is a big deal. There are a range of new computational tools that can automate the production and distribution of personalized data stories at a level that has previously been essentially unimaginable. So I'm going to propose here that journalism should use these tools to make every single relevant data story available to every single person in a way that they can actually genuinely really access and use. That's my manifesto for data journalism. And I'm going to just leave this slide here. This is my argument on a slide, and that's the end of my talk.